Roger Butler is the first man to come out as gay publicly, voluntarily, to the whole of Britain by writing a letter in a newspaper in 1960.
Roger Butler was the first man to come out, and that reshapes our understanding of the 20th century and the history of gay rights. And it changed my understanding of how coming out as an idea has evolved.
I think perhaps there's certainly not a unique experience, but a distinctive one of queer people that we often find ourselves, I think, relating to people who are a generation above or perhaps two. Our copy editor said basically this is a love story, isn't it? We tell this as almost two stories in parallel, Roger's life and then my meeting and my relationship with Roger.
Really excited to be joined today by Christopher and Louise. And I wondered if before we jump into some questions, if I could get you to please introduce yourselves and maybe a bit about how you know each other.
My name's Christopher Stevens. I am an academic theologian by background. I work in South West London, and most of my work these days is about investigating faith communities, questions around why people in faith communities do the things that they do and how they do them, and how we can help communities to flourish, especially around issues of diversity and inclusion.
And I'm Louise Radnofsky. I am, like Christopher, a co-author of The Light of Day, first man to come out at the dawn of gay liberation. I'm also a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I live in Washington, D.C. Been friends with Christopher for more than 20 years.
Incredible.
Helped my partner and I to have a baby, who's now not a baby anymore. And we wrote a book.
We met, I won't say how many years ago, at university as undergraduates. We were both LGB reps for our college.
What it was called at the time.
In those days, it was LGB, long time ago, unfortunately. We met because my college, we wanted to meet more people, more queer people. So we sent out an invitation to Louise's college to see if they were interested in coming along. And so we invited them over for a party. And
3 of us turned up. There were 30 of them. We didn't really hold up our own.
Mine was quite a gay college at the time. These guys came along and they were lovely. So we kept them as part of our little family through those years. And Louise and I have stayed really good friends since then.
Amazing. That's so lovely. And so you've written a book together, and I wondered if for our listeners you could sort of introduce what the book is about, potentially.
Of course. So the main story in this is that we talk about Roger Butler, who is the first man to come out as gay publicly, voluntarily, to the whole of Britain by writing a letter in a newspaper in 1960. And he does it as part of the Homosexual Law Reform Society's campaigning to try to get the law changed, because at that time and until 1967, male homosexuality was criminalised. I knew Roger much later in his life, and on his death, which happened in 2011, I inherited his papers. And so the story weaves quite a lot of Roger's own narrative about that time and about the rest of his life, how he came to the point of doing this quite revolutionary thing, and then subsequently what happened as a result of that, and then how his life progressed. Roger wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. He was an avid writer, actually, recorder of his own life and the lives of the people that he loved and knew and was interested in. And so we've managed to use a lot of that original material to weave in Roger's voice as well. So the story is quite an interesting one of how Roger got involved as one of the very earliest volunteers for the Homosexual Law Reform Society. So in 1958, as a very young man. And it takes us through Roger's sort of exciting entree into the underground criminalised gay world of London in those days. And then takes us out the other end as well and has a look at the impact that Roger's letter had specifically on the gay rights movement, but then also on his own life and how that proceeded. Roger lost his sight in the 1960s as well, and so he actually dropped out of the law reform movement. And part of what we've done in this book is to try to to redress that, really, because it was his disability that caused him to be marginalised, really, pushed him out of London, pushed him out of the law reform movement at the time, and which means that his story really has been lost to the mainstream history. So we are reviving it and identifying Roger for gay people, really, as a figure from their past that they really ought to know about.
Yeah.
The other side of the story is about how I got to know Roger. So we weave that narrative in slightly as well, looking at what gay life was like in the early 2000s when I came out and when I met Roger, and how our relationship developed to the point that he trusted me with his story and with his papers.
And how did you decide how to structure the book in terms of weaving those sort of different narratives together?
I think we decide we settle on every possible permutation of how we might tell this story. I think because the book has several different stories in it, a lot of different people had a lot of different opinions, and we also did at various points, about what was most important to emphasize and how much of the other stuff to include. But we're, in the end, able to tell this story that focuses quite closely on Roger's years of being young in London, active in the early gay rights movement, and then explains the rest of his life, perhaps in a somewhat more condensed format, but because there's less change occurring there. He essentially spends the last 30 years of his life in a house in East Oxford, which is where Christopher finds him. And then within that, we needed to both tell Christopher's story, as we said, but finding the connections between Christopher's story. There were many, and Roger's story, particularly as young gay men in very different eras, with some contrast, but also some really fascinating similarities. We wanted to sort of weave those together in a way that made the links clear.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I explain in the first part of the book is about the earliest times that I spent with Roger, which was me as a young student cycling across Oxford to go and see Roger and to read to him, because that's initially why I went to spend time with him. As an older blind person, he couldn't access all of the written materials that he wanted to. This is 20 odd years ago, so the technology wasn't even what it is today. But Roger also enjoyed reading with other people there. For him, it was a way of thinking about what he was reading, engaging with it, talking about it with another person. So I was seeing him, and I would cycle once a week, every week on a Tuesday night to go and see him. And we realized that one of the things that we were doing when we were looking at weaving in these two stories was almost mimicking that journey, that relationship, going back to Roger once a week, back to Regent Street where he lived, back to that house, that sort of slightly safe space, and bringing the reader along with us was a good way to give them some sort of experience which mirrored my own with him.
And what have you sort of found the reception to the book has been like since it's come out? How have people sort of responded to it?
It's been very, very positive. We've had some really surprising people. I certainly have people contacting me on social media quite a lot, saying, "Oh gosh, I had a relationship a little bit like yours with an older queer person, and I'm trying to think about what I can do to honour their legacy." So people who have shared a similar kind of experience to my own, which I think that has surprised me, because, of course, I think all of Roger's history from the 50s and 60s is really, really fascinating, and it's a bit of his life that I didn't know that much about. And so I didn't think that kind of my own experiences would be as interesting to other people, because it's just the life that I've led. So that has been very surprising. But we've found that different groups of people, we were talking about this quite recently actually, different groups of people seem to have responded to different parts of the book.
Okay.
Very very positively, in a way that surprised us. So a lot of gay people will know some of the history that we talk about. Now, Roger's perspective on it, that sort of lived experience of running through it, is unique. and interesting. But many people will know what was going on during the 50s and 60s in the law reform movement. And so actually many of the queer people who have read it because of the fact that they wanted to learn about this new part of that history have been really surprised then to go on and read about other parts of the life that Roger led, and particularly his experiences in the 1960s of losing his sight, his engagement with both the NHS and also broader society, I suppose, about how blind people were treated in those days, what they were and weren't given and helped with, and what was expected of them. And a first-person account of somebody going through a very protracted, very difficult experience of losing their sight and having to completely reinvent their life, which is what Roger had to do, I think is something which then has surprised many of those readers as something they weren't really expecting necessarily to read about in a book like this, and which perhaps they haven't read about in other kinds of material that they've picked up.
And you mentioned that there were two men who alongside Roger wrote the letter, Raymond and Robert, and you sort of said in the book that you'd be really keen to learn more about them if anyone knew of them or knows them. And I wondered if anyone had contacted you in reference to them at all since the book's come out.
They have not, so I'll happily reiterate our interest in hearing from anyone who knew a man called Raymond Gregson or Robert Moorcroft, who might have been active in the 1950s Homosexual Law Reform Society in London. One of them had been married before, but wasn't at the time that Roger knew him. And Roger didn't know them particularly well. We mentioned this in the book, but Roger hit upon his idea to write a letter coming out to the entire country freely and explicitly in two major national news magazines of the day after a public meeting that he'd gone to, in which various straight people who were speaking on behalf of the Homosexual Law Reform Society and the gay men that it was representing really annoyed him in the way that they were talking about this issue. And so, like a good revolutionary, he goes to the pub afterwards, gets fired up and hits upon this idea that he's going to write this letter. And he does, and he wants more people to sign it. But he goes around to basically everybody he knows, and nobody else is willing to do that, apart from these two people he didn't know particularly well, but he knew them for a brief moment in time. They were this united trio and three of the four most important gay rights activists in the country in this sort of month almost where they're later invited to do a newspaper panel as well, and they speak to that, and they bring real live breathing homosexuals into the living rooms of all of England through this paper, the Sunday Pictorial. But we feel as though we uncovered Roger from a fairly dusty bin of history. And when we started to delve deeper into his story, it just became more and more extraordinary. And I think we're very aware that behind any door that a young student happens to knock on, it could be a similarly astonishing story waiting for there.
And this is one of the interesting things that we are noticing at the moment is a pickup, I think, in interest around this period in history, the 1950s and into the early 60s. And I think part of that is because so many of the stories have been lost. And that's in part, of course, because the lives that gay men were leading in that period were criminalized. And so they didn't keep records. They if they had personal letters from that time, they hid them or they burnt them, they destroyed them. There's another person who was involved in the law reform movement a bit later, Stuart Feather, who's an author, talks about if there was a code for living as a gay man in this period, it would be to basically leave no evidence of who you are and what you're doing. Don't write to any other gay people. Certainly don't talk about your feelings on paper. And so there's a very limited amount of material that exists from that time, which is a kind of first person expression. And you might go to the National Archives and look at what was going on at that time there. But actually all that material is official records of people being sent to prison or court proceedings because they were being arrested for being gay men. But there's very little actually from those gay men themselves in many of these archives. And so trying to locate where the material is, I think is a really important thing for writers, for historians, for anyone who's interested in gay rights as well, because actually those who were young men in 1967 even now are becoming, if they've lived this long, they're very old men now. So where is that stuff? Of course, many of the people who were of that generation then went through the AIDS pandemic, and a number of them would have been lost during that period too. So the records are pretty sparse. So that's, I think, another reason that's contributed to us not really knowing much about those two other men that were working with Roger. But there will be dozens of others who were doing really important things at this time, volunteering day in, day out. They wouldn't have necessarily got much public praise for it, if any, but they were doing the hard work of campaigning. They were the grassroots campaigners for this cause, and we don't even know their names.
I wondered, I mean, if potentially you could talk a bit about how reading these papers and these letters, that Roger had left, how that changed your relationship to him, if it changed or shifted how you thought about him.
Yeah, so I met him when he was an older man. It's 2003 when I met him, and so he was in his late 60s then. And he had, as Louise said earlier, he'd been living in a quiet East Oxford house on his own for a number of decades by that point. And he had a very ordered, very consistent kind of life. His patterns of living were quite regular. And that was partly due to the restrictions he had as an older person who didn't have any sight. He didn't have a guide dog by that stage. He didn't like to leave his house just using a white cane. He felt very vulnerable doing that. And he had a few friends who would pop in and see him, and he had a number of readers. But it was a very, like I said, very contained kind of existence. And Roger was a very quiet, thoughtful sort of person. And for me, going to his house as a student, when I was kind of discovering who I was and going to lots of parties and working really hard and playing really hard, it was a bit of an oasis for me to go to his house every Tuesday evening and have a quiet time reading together, having a chat. He's a very clever, very insightful sort of person, and educated me an awful lot during that period in a whole number of things. And so that was my experience of Roger as a man during that time. And so going back then to engage with Roger as a young man, so he goes to London as a 17-year-old and is engaging with the Homosexual Law Reform Society just a few years later than that. He's like a totally different person in some ways. I mean, the core Roger is still there. You can still see the way that he was thinking and the way that he was talking. But actually, he's such a brave person, quite a spontaneous person, I'd say as well. He didn't plan to write that letter in 1960. He didn't kind of spend months penning every word of it and thinking through, okay, who might be able. He just got really angry with the way that gay people were being spoken about, even by the people who were supposed to be the leaders of the law reform movement, and is fired up and goes off and decides, right, I'm going to do this thing. Why the hell shouldn't we make ourselves known using our own names? That's what he thinks. And then he writes this letter, and within days it's been sent off. And it's hugely bold. And then within a couple of weeks, he's off being interviewed by one of the biggest tabloid newspapers in the country, the Sunday Pictorial, speaking on behalf of gay people. And the sort of slightly reserved, shyish older man that I met feels an age away. And I suppose he was by that point a generation away from that younger man. So that was fascinating. The other side of it for me, I suppose, was learning quite how painful, both physically and emotionally, it was for Roger to go through the experiences he had later on losing his sight. I, of course, met him when he'd been blind for a very long time, and he had learnt how to manage the limitations that caused him in a very, very competent sort of way. He, as I said before, he led a very structured kind of life, and that enabled him to live as freely as he could within his own home. And so I suppose he downplayed in terms of how he spoke to me about his sight, some of the awfulness, frankly, of what he went through as a younger man when he lost his sight. I knew that he still, as an older man, struggled to really deal with the fact that he could no longer experience some things that he had really loved as a younger man. He was a big photographer, actually. He loved to travel and see new places. He loved architecture. And those were things which he could no longer experience in the same way, quite to the same level as he had before. And he regretted that. He was sad about it. But I'd never really understood until I read all of his papers quite what a horrific time he had. Not just because, of course, losing your sight is going to be a traumatic experience, but because of the way that blind people in those days were treated, almost as a problem that needed to be managed. We've talked a bit, Louise and I, during the course of writing this, about the similarities in terms of how gay people are spoken about and blind people are spoken about during that period. That actually it's a sad group that's sort of unfortunate, needs to be sort of fixed in some way, managed in a way not to cause trouble to mainstream society. And so even the proponents of law reform for gay people just want to find a way to manage this issue, rather than saying, let's treat every gay person like an individual who could flourish in all these brilliant ways and could achieve just as many things as anyone else. Similarly with blind people, the expectation is, well, you might just about get a manual labor job if you're lucky. That's kind of the ambition that Roger has communicated to him when he loses his sight. And I mean, the irony is that actually for him, losing his sight becomes a trigger for him to go off and achieve the ambition that he has always had, to go to university and to study for a degree, which really radically transforms his life in some ways totally positively. But that, I think, was something that, it was sad for me to realize that someone I loved in the way that I had, very, very, very close friend of mine, had gone through quite such a painful time.
I wondered is there, from writing this book, is there something that you've both, from writing the book and from, reading all of his papers and getting to know him in this way, and also your relationship to him, Christopher, I mean, has it shifted the way that you view friendships and relationships in your own life?
I think so. Well, the co-writing of the book was a significant undertaking, and I think has deepened our friendship. Including through, some difficult conversations about word choices. Christopher's love of the word amongst is a talking point, and that's been a really wonderful labor of love. But of course, the book has also been a labor of love for Christopher in ways in which he fulfilled Roger's, really his dying request for him to help his story see the light of day. And that has been a journey, I think, for him as well, in going through the process of reading Roger's papers, and also some of Roger's more personal writings to Christopher directly, in which he makes his instruction, but also tells him a lot of other things.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we have thought through, perhaps in more depth, with more deliberate interest than perhaps I had done, at least previously, was this question around intergenerational friendships as well. And I think perhaps it's certainly not a unique experience, but a distinctive one of queer people, that we often find ourselves, I think, relating to people who are a generation above, or perhaps two, us as younger people. Partly because the experiences we have as young people aren't ones that necessarily our families or friends have had or are able to share with us as we're growing up, even if we're able to share who we are authentically to those people, which I know some people can. But actually, you might have a group of really close friends and a really loving family, but if somebody hasn't grown up gay or queer in some way, then it's difficult to empathize, I think. And that certainly was one aspect, I think, of why Roger and I became so close, why we quickly moved from that relationship of just me being another of Roger's readers to me being a friend and someone who went and helped to look after him and stay with him and took him on trips and holidays, long walks, that sort of thing. As we chatted, we had this common experience. Roger talks in his own memoir both about how sort of electric it was to be in gay bars, gay clubs, in gay society in the 1950s, 60s, because a social barrier had been pulled away, precisely because of the shared identity, the shared criminalized identity. It meant that the sorts of people who never would have dreamt of socializing with one another or being in the same establishment, in the same place, because of their age or their ethnicity or their professional identity or whatever it might be, actually all get thrown together. And so there's this sort of immediate, the veil is lifted. Everyone sort of smiles and chats to one another. And although, of course, the world has changed radically, I think to a degree that does still exist within queer communities, and certainly across generations as well. Roger had an older gay man, a generation older than him, that he had a very close relationship with as well. Now, they actually only met a few times, but they wrote letters to one another 14 years. Roger kept all of those letters, and they form part of the narrative that Louise and I use in the book about Roger's life. But there's this extraordinary connection between this man who was born, when he sat on the knee of Queen Victoria, this man Lionel Fielden. He's of that generation, and after the war he moves out to Italy and is living with his lover actually for a very long time in Tuscany. Roger goes and visits him. But Lionel sees Roger's letter in the New Statesman, this coming out letter in 1960, and writes a letter of congratulations to him saying, gosh, I almost thought this was a joke because of the risk involved and they're seeing it so starkly on the page. But actually Lionel himself was about to publish his autobiography in which he's pretty open about his own sexuality. So that there was this common bond, and they become really, really close to one another, even though, as I say, they actually only meet a few times in person. And I see an element of that in the relationship I had with Roger, lived out in a different time and in practically in a different way, but actually that common bond and a sense that here is someone who has gone through a similar kind of thing to me, but also has some incredible history to tell me about from a generation past of what life would have been like for me had I been born then.
Hi, we wanted to quickly ask you if you could please subscribe to Sex in Space. Every click of that button helps us to keep doing the work that we do and bring you more great podcast episodes like this one. Don't just listen, commit, subscribe, and stay in our orbit.
I wondered, because we sort of spoke about before we started recording about the audiobook, and I wondered if you could possibly talk a bit about what recording that was like and how that was quite a special experience for this book.
We wanted the audiobook to be as special of an experience as the printed book would be for readers. There's some photographs in the middle of the printed book, and for readers of the audiobook, for listeners of the audiobook, you will get some bonus material towards the end that does not appear in the book. The printed book of Roger speaking, and you can actually hear his voice. But in addition, you'll get to hear Christopher read the parts that are written in his voice in the book, and a really wonderful actor, Griff Melhuish, who is doing a fantastic job of reading the chapters, and in particular, there's a lot of Roger's. There's a lot of our writing about what was going on, but there's also a lot of extracts of material from the time, and I think Griff does a fantastic job of really emphasizing what is what and who is speaking at any moment. Really difficult to follow otherwise.
Absolutely, yeah. We were. It was a hard thing to think through how we might do justice to it, I think, because our book draws on so much source material from Roger's writing, from other people's writings. It has our voice as authors, it has my voice talking about my experience, and so we really did want to make sure that there was a diversity in there of experience in terms of listening to the audiobook.
Mm.
Reading my parts myself was, I mean, it's an interesting one. I've never done that before, and like most people, you have that horrible reaction to your own voice when you first hear it recorded back to you. But there's not enough time to worry about those sorts of things when you're doing an audiobook. I had one day to do all of my bits.
Wow.
And I was really enjoying it by the end. There is something about reading aloud which brings a totally different experience, for me at least, than just reading off the page to myself. I had that experience with Roger for many years, and I learned from it how rich an experience it can be to take your time going through material, to understand the emphases of every sentence, not to allow yourself to skip ahead and go, oh, this, I know this bit, or don't need to read that extract, you've made the point already, whatever it might be. And so doing that with our own material, and particularly those parts I read, which are my own voice, was an important thing, I think, to do at that stage when we had finalised our text and before we came out in print, just really to sort of bed it all in to me. And I say quite a lot about my emotions and my experiences in there, things which perhaps just in conversation I probably wouldn't just drop in. And so making sure that I've said those things to myself before I say them to the world as well, I think was probably an important threshold for me as well during the publication process.
For anyone listening who is sort of, going, this sounds like a really wonderful book and I'd be interested to learn more, is there something specific that you would want, potential readers to know or to be aware of sort of going into this book?
You should know that Roger Butler was the first man to come out, and that reshapes our understanding of the 20th century and the history of gay rights. I think that's one of the most important things that we do want to tell people. I think we're often led to believe, we certainly have been up until this point, that coming out was an invention of the 1970s, of the Gay Liberation Front. Maybe it came from the United States. And it was truly revelatory for me to understand that there was a man who had done this in England in 1960, 7 years before decriminalization, and a full decade before we had thought it had happened. It both changed my understanding of how coming out as an idea has evolved, and also of that period of time in England, the late 1950s and early 60s, and we've been told that everybody was hiding. No one was willing to step forward. I think that also carries very important lessons about the conditions that create change of any kind in any social movement. But that sense that what Roger identified was that in order for decriminalization of male homosexuality to occur, people needed to understand that gay men were people they could relate to, potentially brothers or sons. And in order for that to happen, you needed to know who they were, or you needed to at least know who one of them was. Roger regrets a number of opportunities that his name is not particularly famous or indeed known at all to anyone. And he thinks how wonderful it would be if an E.M. Forster were to write a letter that was both explicit about his identity and said, I have a direct stake in this issue. I'm not just writing about it in a rational, detached kind of view about those other people over there and what they need. And ultimately what he realizes is that E.M. Forster isn't going to do that, and that nobody else is going to come and rescue him. And he has to do it himself, even if he doesn't think his own name is particularly worthwhile. And it turns out, in fact, that his own name is more than enough to generate a conversation that lasts for months across the news magazines where the letter is published, and to spark all kinds of other sorts of change, and to send out a beacon that reaches Tuscany, where I don't feel that writes to him, but also a beacon across the entire country where other men write to him and express either admiration at his bravery or sadness that they cannot do the same thing, or sometimes a mix of both. But that role that is played by an ordinary person who is just part of the grassroots of this movement, has an idea and then acts on it, has such power. And the idea that he conceived of, you can see played out in activist movements all over again, as they recognize potential value in having arguments made by individuals, both because it humanizes them, because it normalizes them, and because it shows, frankly, that Roger's not ashamed. It's very difficult in the late 1950s, Roger recognizes for gay men to make an argument that there's nothing to be ashamed of if they're not willing to say that they're gay.
Yeah.
And if they're willing to do it, but they do it behind a pseudonym, that doesn't really help remove that sense of shame. And if they do it because they've been caught, that is helpful. It's eye-opening for Roger when he reads a book by a gay man who has been put on trial publicly and then afterwards decides to tell his story on his own terms. That story being told helps Roger understand who he is. But it's also very difficult to make the argument for decriminalization if you are yourself criminalized under it. You can, and Peter Wildeblood makes this extraordinary passionate argument for prison reform at the same time that he's writing his book. But when Roger is able to step forward calmly and confidently and make the argument that homosexuality is nothing to be ashamed of without having been caught first, without the sort of grubby trappings of an arrest surrounding him, it does put it in a different light for a number of people. And it also makes it extraordinarily brave because, of course, he has everything to lose by doing this, and he decides to do it anyway because he also understands the importance of what he's doing. And it's all been striking. I will also say that it's a little unnerving. I was a student of history. Roger was a student of history as well, and it's a little bit both exciting but also, as I said, unnerving to realize that something we had understood to be really true about the origins of coming out and gay rights is not. In fact, needs to be significantly revised. That's part of the excitement process too, that history is constantly being reinterpreted, rediscovered. But it is jarring that Roger was lost for so long for what he did, and that he had been recognized by his contemporaries as having established a milestone, and then that over time that milestone was essentially became grown over and obscured and needed to be dusted off. And through a series of fortunate events, Roger was rescued. In part, Roger had his own agency in his own rescue because he wrote so extensively and left so many details for people to find him again.
In addition to all of that, if anyone is thinking about buying the book, engaging in the story, one thing I would say is that it's not a sort of dry third-person account. It's not like the history book, because I read it at university. Although we have, of course, done an awful lot of research and made sure that there's a rich historical narrative in there. We've been called all kinds of things. We've been categorized in all kinds of ways. You know, this is history. This is LGBT history. This is social history. This is archival research. Actually, no, this is memoir. This is
biography.
Biography.
Well, it's also biography. You know, there's all this.
It's a love story. You know, our copy editor said this is a love story, isn't it? And we tell it as a story. We tell this as almost two stories in parallel. Roger's life and then my meeting and my relationship with Roger. It's very, very personal, and it's at times quite emotional. And I think people are often surprised by those qualities in the book. Many people have grabbed it because, oh gosh, here's something new about gay history. I'd love to learn about that, which is fantastic. But then they're brought into a much more personal, sort of empathetic kind of reading experience, I think, with an individual human or a series of individual humans who, you know, do brave things, lose their loves, are rejected, have kind of, you know, some furtive sexual experience, or that kind of stuff. It's quite it's extremely broad, I think, in terms of the genres that we touch on, but also the range of stories that are being told in here. So hopefully it's something which will keep people's attention as they work through the material, because it's sort of ever changing in one way.
And there are very valuable books, including about gay history, that you read in chapters and you put away and you rest and you reflect on and come back to. This isn't that, actually. It's a book that we've been told by people, including some people who are coming at it skeptically, that they couldn't put down. Very useful book if you want to take it on a summer holiday. It is beach reading in a way that you might not think gay history would ordinarily be, but that's because of the accessibility of the voices. If you are struggling to find it on the shelves in some way because of how it's been labeled, you can either ask for it by title or look out for something that's sort of black and orangey on the spine, or this rather striking cover. And obviously it's searchable as well through all the ordinary ways. But categorization has been a bit elusive, which is a strength of the book.
Yeah,
possibly
yeah,
a bit of a
absolutely.
difficulty in finding it.
I think ultimately it will be a strength. We're aware, this is a book about someone that people haven't heard of. That's part of its excitement from our point of view and from others, but it also means that we understand that people are going to learn about this through lots of different ways. They're not going to suddenly think, oh, Roger Butler, gosh, I want to read a book about him, because they won't have a clue who Roger Butler is. And so we're really keen to explore how different people will engage with the material, whether it's through gay history, whether it's through disability history, whether it's through memoir narrative, those sorts of things. We're keen to give people lots of entry points into it. Of course, that means sometimes it's a bit elusive on a bookshelf.
Also, it pains us a little bit to say that the early 2000s are a historical period. We're still living in them, and we're still very young. They were an incredibly interesting time to be young and gay, with a period of change that unfolded in the 1990s, when we were just coming of age, around gays in the military, equalization of the age of consent, the abolition of Section 28, the emergence of civil partnerships that later became equal marriage. All of this stuff sort of happened in an 8-year period around the time when we were applying for university, we were at university, and we were just coming out into the world in London. And I really enjoyed reliving it. And again, while it's really difficult to understand that some people who are old enough to listen to a podcast might not have lived through that period themselves, because it was quite such a long time ago, it's actually really interesting history too, and worth talking to people about. You can hear us talk about it. You can also ask some random 40-something about what that time was like. But it was exciting, and you can possibly rediscover Queer as Folk wherever that's replaying, which is just iconic stuff. You can rewatch while you're rewatching Dawson's Creek, which I know people are doing anyway. You can find the Jack and Ethan stuff, and then just imagine that that's the only gay stuff that's out there, basically, that you find, and how transformational that had been for us at the time.
Even thinking through the sort of broader historical moments that Louise has just mentioned, the changes in the law, I suppose, it's fascinating to see some of the parallels in terms of how those questions are being dealt with during that more modern period, and how MPs and sort of broader social commentary were dealing with homosexuality in the 1950s, 1960s. Some of the comments that you read from the tabloids in the 1950s about evil men who are trying to corrupt your children, basically, you see things which are not wholly dissimilar from those narratives in really even into the late 1990s sometimes, when there's a suggestion that reducing the age of consent to be equal with heterosexual people is somehow going to corrupt 17-year-old boys into becoming gay, because of course otherwise they would have grown up just to be quote normal people. So some of those discourses that exist, and some of the reasons that politicians who perhaps are sympathetic to change but don't vote for change in Parliament are making that choice, also are seen in parallel during those two periods. So people who are perhaps personally committed to gay people having the liberties that they want, and might have gay friends and be very used to it all, but are not willing to stand up and say this law is wrong because they're worried about how that will look. And of course Roger Butler he's not an MP, but he's the one man who is willing to stand up and say, I am this thing. I don't care how that makes me look in your eyes. This is what you should understand about gay people. Is such a beacon during that time. And of course, in the more latter period, we had our own people standing up, our own sort of human rights heroes of that period too. And it's very interesting to see some of those patterns play out in future generations from the earliest ones. Yeah.
I found the book, it was very moving. I felt very sort of emotionally connected and invested in the story, and I really enjoyed the structure of it. And it, like you say, it did feel like going sort of like a safe space in a way, and kind of being in that sort of environment. It was such a lovely read, and so I want to just congratulate you both on such a wonderful book.
Thank you so much.
And for listeners who are going, this sounds incredible, I want to grab a copy, where can they find the book?
First of all, in bookshops. Roger absolutely has his life-changing moment in a bookshop. Christopher and I both had life-changing moments as younger people in bookshops when we found that first book that really made us think, wow, this is telling me something about myself. So first of all, consider supporting your local bookshop. Consider supporting, if you have access to one, your local queer bookshop, because queer bookshops have been so nice to us recently. We just feel the need to sort of re-emphasize that. They're really fantastic spaces. But of course, there are all sorts of different ways to access books, and whatever works for you, works for you. And
yeah, this is on general release. You can buy it pretty much anywhere that sells a book. So it's in your station, and it's in your high street, and it's online, of course. And as we've been talking about as well, it's available as an audiobook on all kinds of platforms for those who prefer or who are only able to engage with it in that way.
And an e-book as well, for that matter.
Yeah, and we're very, very committed to this getting to all the people who need to hear it as well. And part of what we talk about in this is the importance of coming out. And we recognise that holding a book that talks about a gay man on the front cover isn't going to necessarily be all that easy for some people, perhaps some younger people who live with their families and haven't come out to them or can't. And so having an e-reader version or listening to an audiobook is of course going to be more appropriate for them as well sometimes. So do get access to it if you can.
I wanted to ask one final question, because there was something sort of at the end of the book. You noted that Roger pondered one question for many years, which is what makes a life important. And I wondered if possibly each of you could speak to what you think makes a life important, in whatever way you interpret that question to mean.
For me, the most important way to live is an authentic one, and I think Roger, for me, is a beacon of that. Really, it's not that he is by instinct a revolutionary person, that he does what he does. It's not that he's an agitator. In many ways, he's quite a staid, conformist sort of person. But because he is not willing to sacrifice living authentically in the world as who he is, and to stand by that and say, this is simply who I am. It's no better or worse than anybody else, but I'm not going to pretend that I'm something else, and I'm not willing to give up on having the kinds of relationships, the loves, the friendships that are authentic to me, that pushes him towards becoming a revolutionary type person during this period. And I think that, that would be my answer to your question, that to live authentically as who you are, not to try to conform to social expectations or what you think your friends want you to be, or what's cool, or what's flashy or on trend, whatever. None of that. Be who you are, be that authentically, and allow others to be the same.
I think Roger really struggles to assess his own value in many ways. The value of the letter, the role he played in society, whether he'd ever done anything meaningful. And he simultaneously gives us all the tools to discover what Roger did by writing about it in such depth and in such detail, and through such a laborious process as well for him. I mean, the way that he had to write was very, very difficult. From a braille sketch to a typing it out to a recording it onto a dictaphone to play back and make edits and revisions. And he did this for so many years with the idea that there would be a bank of material that he himself would be unable to read, but other people could see it after him. And leave a legacy. And ultimately, there's this sort of act of faith on Roger's part that by writing all of this, maybe somebody will decide for him that he has, in fact, been important. But he also knows it just enough to create these memories, to record them. Even if they aren't of value to anybody else, he knows that the act of doing it has a fulfillment for him as well. The other thing is that Roger constantly is assessing the value of a life based on is whether he was loved, and he loved. And I don't want to spoil the ending of the book. I really think it's worth reading, having gone through some of the earlier portions. But Roger does does come to some conclusions late in his life about that, and learning what those conclusions are was also very revelatory for Christopher.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much. Before we end, I wanted to ask, is there anything I haven't touched on that you'd like to share, or anything that you'd want to talk about?
That ending question. I don't have anything that I want to get in on it, but it's such a good end of interview question. Did you say anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that as we said before, the book is so varied. There's so many different types of story going on and types of material that we could have moved in all kinds of directions, but we've covered an awful lot. And I suppose an invitation to anyone who does read it, who has experiences to share or particular responses to any aspect of the book. We're always so keen to hear about whether it's someone who has their own Roger somewhere, or has had their own Roger, or someone who's thinking about this period, or somebody perhaps who has experienced either themselves or the loved one losing their sight, and has related to some of what Roger says in here too. You know, we love to hear what people think, and to hear some of the bits of stories that are in here being extended out in different directions by other people's lives. You know, that's important to us. This book is a testament, I think, to the value of engaging in depth with one person's life experiences, and seeing the value of that, even if they're not a flashy celebrity name. We're super keen to hear about other people's lives that were just as special.
I'll make sure for our listeners, I'll put how you can contact Christopher and Louise in the episode description, so you can get in touch, and also some links to buy the book as well. Thank you both so much.